All right, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. As most of you know, I'm Sophie Smith, the Assistant Director of York Public Library, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our program this evening about the climate politics of contemporary Europe. This program comes to us by way of the Camden Conference, which is an annual global symposium on world affairs held up in Camden, Maine, but it has statewide satellite participation at different libraries throughout the area, and we're happy to host them here in York. The theme this year is Europe Challenged at Home and Abroad. And you can find out more about the conference that begins on Friday at camdenconference.org. This also fits into the climate series that York Public Library and the York Climate Action Plan folks have put together to explore different facets of the climate conversation. Last week, we heard from Mike Sinclair about local fisheries, this week, climate politics in Europe, and next week, more about Maine's statewide climate actions. You can learn more about this program series and the other programs to come at yorkpubliclibrary.org/climate, where you can register for any and all of the programs that you'd like. We are recording tonight's event, and it will be available on our website within the next few days. By default, I have everyone muted right now, but when Dr. Hancock is ready for questions, please feel free to unmute and ask away. You're also welcome to use the chat feature, and I'll pass along your questions to our presenter. So without further ado, let's get started with an introduction. Dr. Susana Hancock began her academic career as a 14-year-old strolling the halls of the University of Southern Maine, where she studied astrophysics. Although initially drawn to the extraterrestrial, she soon realized that we had more to learn about the fragile ecosystem on this planet than we do about far-off galaxies. Since graduating with 3 degrees from the University of Oxford, she is now a multidisciplinary Arctic climate researcher and has lived throughout the European Arctic. She has been an invited speaker at international TED events, UN conferences, and other global fora. Susana has served as an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, co-chaired a team with the UN's Decade of Ocean Science. She is vice president for the International Association for Polar Early Career Scientists, and now heads up a new international team addressing the socio-geopolitical impacts of the climate crisis in the polar regions. Locally, she is on the Executive Committee for Democracy Maine and Citizens Climate Lobby. She's a part of Maine Youth for Climate Justice on the RSU5 Board and her town's Sustainability Advisory Board, and several other many things. She's also apparently just started a new environmental nonprofit. She's actually visiting or speaking to us from Europe today, and we're so lucky she could fit us in. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hancock.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So yes, it is 1 a.m. and so apologies for any glitches in attention and all of that. So I'm going to start off just by sharing my screen. Okay. All right. So yes, I'm just going to talk. It's titled Paris at 6, just with the Paris Accords being now 6 years old. So using that as a bit of a foundation and looking at and focusing with the conference theme in Europe this year, sort of climate politics in Europe and sort of post-Paris Accords in 2015, where we are, where we go from here, etc. So with that, I wanted to show this brief little clip. I'm not sure it's going to play. Hold on, I'm not sure this is working. I did just check this all. Geez, okay, we're gonna skip this slide. I did just check this all right before starting and it worked. So hold on 1 second. I love technology. All right, and I'm gonna skip that slide because I'm gonna show it on YouTube because I know this slide was challenging today. So off here. So this right here is Ed Hawkins, is a climate scientist, sorry, at the University of Reading in England. And he put this together and I just wanted to share it quickly. But basically here, I didn't start it from the beginning, just to go through it a little bit more quickly, but increasing temperatures and internet's a bit slow. This is supposed to go all the way up to 2022. But what you can see here is, the 0, 1.5, and 2 degrees that we talk about with the Paris Accords. And this is 0, we're talking about is the temperature above the pre-industrial, sort of industrial era. So we're talking about that as being the mid 1800s. And so this 1.5 degrees is not 1.5 degrees of warming. Cumulatively, it's 1.5 degrees of where we were around the world on an average 160, 170 years ago. So with that, I'll go back here and let's try this again. So basic outline of what I'm going to say is just get into a little bit of the accelerating climate shifts, brief history of the UN processes, again, mentioning that the Paris Accords, part of that tends to be, although not certainly a perfect system, tends to be the best system that we have at the international level to get these communications going on. And then again, returning back to the Paris Accords, where we were, where we are, where we're going. A little bit about Glasgow, COP26 conference, UN's climate summit that happened last November. And then framing this around Europe being part of the Camden Conference theme, again, so seeing Europe as where Europe is taking the lead in here. So Europe, at least on the continental side, may not really be where we're seeing Europe as a leader. But I think what's quite interesting is if we look at this slide, the column on the left is looking at European opinions about different global threats. And that was 2018, so pre-COVID. But what you can see is that global climate change is the top concern that was mentioned to the Pew Research Center 2018 with 10 different European countries. On the right is post-COVID, so this is 2020, so still in the beginning of COVID, but in the sort of we don't really know what it is, where it's going phase. This does pull 14 countries, so it's the same 10 European countries and then several countries that are not in Europe, so Japan, South Korea, Australia, the United States, for example. But what's interesting here is that global climate change amongst those countries still comes out on top of spread of infectious disease, not surprising, quite close together. And also what I find interesting is that all of these sub concerns relate directly in some capacity to global climate change. So whether it's cyber attacks, terrorism, infectious disease, poverty, ethnic conflict, migration, it's sort of all there. So I'll start off with a little bit of what this might mean in practice, sort of a visualization. I work in polar climate, and this, my sort of first experience in polar climate was working on a glacier in Iceland with the British Antarctic Survey. This is a picture of that glacier when I was in grade school. And so this is before I was there, but this was it last year, 2 years ago. So you can see the difference, recession, shrinking of the glacier from all directions. And this is another photograph of it. This was, again, this one was taken in 1999, so well before I was there. And this was in 2019, so 20 years later. And you can see, again, that recession in that glacier. So this is just sort of some images of melting, what's going on. Iceland did celebrate, honor the first glacier in 2018 that it marked as being lost to the changing climate, pretty much exclusively. So what about climate policies? Those are, again, these UN processes, these international policies are here to curb this melting. So Kyoto, many of you may be familiar with the Kyoto Protocol, where it was successful, where it wasn't so successful. And so I think one thing that's kind of scary for me, at least, working in this international climate area and working on several of these fora, is that, let's see, in this graph, this is the scale of warming. So this is also something that came out of Ed Hawkins from Reading University's work, where he started these climate graphs, climate lines, climate stripes. where each year is marked by a different color corresponding to its relative warmth. So this goes back to 1979 with the first World Climate Conference. It's just where we're starting to get those reds creep in. And so when we've had these climate conferences, the temperature is getting warmer. So it's not really the direction that we want to see. And so the COP process, which is started by the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, began in 1994 with the first COP. COP stands for Council of Parties. That's just all the ratifiers for the UNFCCC, began in Bonn, Germany. It was basically the reaction of let's all come together and figure out what we can do on a global scale. So just looking, at Paris, the Paris Accords came out of the 21st COP, which was held, surprisingly, in Paris in 2015. So what made this, I think, Paris Accords, it is the process under which we're currently working, but it also took a completely different look at climate legislation. So where Montreal Protocol, where Kyoto protocols fell short, Paris has really come in to look at what went wrong in the past and how can we move to the future. So not only is it the current legislation under which we're working, it also took a very different approach to global climate, looking at basically the fact that the world is still getting warmer. And there is certainly locked in warmth. So even if we were to be able to cut all emissions right now, the planet would continue to warm for at least a couple of decades. So why did Kyoto fall short, and what is Paris really bringing to the table? Kyoto was very much a top-down approach. So the UN said which countries are considered developed and which countries are considered underdeveloped. And based on whether one was designated as developed or not, transpired into whether that country was responsible for making adjustments. And if responsible, it was told exactly how much it needed to cut its emissions. So these were all orders that came down. The UN decided the standards, and it was up to the countries to meet those, basically. The US never ratified this, so signed on to it, agreed with the principle, but wasn't going to be under these regulations. So from that sense, the US was never on board. The US is the historical largest emitter and was the largest emitter at the time. So without the US being on board, this really struggled to gain ground with other countries saying, why are we doing something that's mandated of us if the biggest problem in the world isn't owning up to it, isn't being part of it? One issue that this had was that there were penalties for failing to meet the agreements, but not penalties for withdrawing. So other countries realized that they were falling short. They weren't going to meet their commitments, their assignments. And in that sense, they withdrew, because if they didn't withdraw, they were going to face large financial penalties, so well into the millions. So that was a bit of sort of the reason why the Kyoto Protocol fell short. So Paris came at this from a different perspective. And basically it was a bottom-up approach. It said all countries are equal in terms of their own ability to self-govern and make those self-decisions. So each country is invited to cut its own emissions, encouraged to do so, but each country can make its own decision for itself. So in that sense, there's financial support for those countries who need it, either for basically climate mitigation, climate adaptation. So there's this Green Climate Fund. There's a focus on adaptation and resilience and low emissions development. So addressing some of those concerns about countries. Back to Kyoto, for example, the US, one reason they said that they didn't want to be part of Kyoto was that China wasn't part of it, because China at this time was designated an underdeveloped country. And this meant that China effectively was able to pollute as much as it wanted without any penalty, whereas the US was being told it was under these certain circumstances, these more stringent controls. And the US said that that's not fair because China can benefit from the US's past emissions and past technologies, current technologies, to learn newer, cleaner activities. So, so there is that focus on countries wanting to develop with Paris, but that focus on low emissions for everybody. So one question that comes out of this, obviously, is if every country is able to do what it feels best that it can, how is that process? How can we make any progress in a world that's generally capitalist and competitive? So the big underlying aspect of Paris that keeps it together is that it works on basically peer pressure. Each country every 5 years submits its own declared contributions. So how much it's going to cut its emissions, how it's going to do that, and its plans. And those are all public. Everybody has access to everybody's information. Everybody knows who has submitted a plan, whether it's comparatively stringent, whether it's not, whether it every 5 years, these are supposed to be increased or stepped up, notched up a bit. So I know, you can go on the internet and find this all out, who has pledged, whether their pledges are more stringent than the past pledges. Pledges this round were due in 2020. Many still haven't arrived, partly because of COVID and also some countries not really following through. So you're getting that peer pressure of, hey, I did this, so you better do it too. And how can we help other people get on board? So this peer pressure through consensus rather than any forcing. So that's basically the premise of what Paris is doing. But its goal, as I said earlier, is to keep the global emissions below 1.5, below 2 degrees centigrade, ideally 1.5 degrees. So as of November of last year at the COP26 conference in Glasgow, 193 members of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change are parties to the agreement. And I believe there are about there are about 4 countries. Too many windows open that are internet is too slow to share my screen directly, so I have to have a section of it shared. So there are only 4 UN FCC countries not part of Paris, of which Iran is the largest, and I believe Iran is maybe 2% of, or just under 1.8% of global emissions. So just for those 1.5, 2 degrees centigrade, that translates to about 2.7 degrees and 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see, those photographs that I showed of my time in Iceland. Some areas are more affected by others. This 1.5, 2 degrees that we're talking about is the world temperatures on aggregate. So that means that Maine, I'm in Monaco, I'm about to go up to the high Arctic next week, the middle of the Pacific, all of those areas average together, total that 1.5 or 2 degrees. So Maine is warming about 3 times faster than many other areas in the continental United States. The Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average. So some areas are cooling. So you have to realize that certain parts, that 1.5 degrees is not just a 2 degree Fahrenheit warming for everybody. So I'm meant to be sharing slides and I wasn't doing that. So yes, this just shows sort of these contributions. So there was 2015 was the first round. 2020, these new submissions of new and updated national designated contributions were put in. 2023, so next year it's gonna be a little bit scary. This is the first global Stocktake. So this is taking all of the contributions and publicly saying what they're actually going to do to emissions, what the current trajectory is. So whether we're on track, what we're actually doing. Of that 1.5 degrees, we're currently at about 1.2 degrees warming that we've already used. So we've got 0.3 degrees effectively effectively left to hit that. And as I said earlier, we've sort of locked in several decades of increased warming. So, and again, because I forgot to share my slides, these are the countries that have signed on to the Paris Accords. So those 4 countries I mentioned, the ones in yellow. The European Union is in dark blue just because it's signed on not just as individual countries, but also as the EU bloc and of kind of parts of the world heating more than others. So you can see that this gets exponentially drastic the warmer the planet goes. So at 4 degrees centigrade warming, the polar regions, the Arctic specifically, is a lot warmer than some of the other areas, but you can see that, you know, obviously land is going to be warmer than the oceans. So yes, here. So this is looking at the climate action tracker, and the climate action tracker goes around and checks certain countries. It doesn't do everybody. So a lot of countries who are in gray here are just not monitored by the system, and looks at whether their goals they've put out now are currently in line with their Paris agreements commitments, or with sort of an overall 2-degree warm temperature world. So you can see that very few, if any, countries, and I believe there are not any right now, are actually in line with Paris. And I think last year it was maybe 1, maybe 2. And they were countries with very low emissions. So the US is now insufficient. Last year it was critically insufficient. So it was like Russia, it was a great country last year. So we're getting some improvements, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that we are back in the Paris Accords where we weren't for a little while. So, but this just gives you sort of that the big emitters really aren't cutting quite yet. And so this is just another view showing us as of 2020 historical emissions. We've got that increase, and then our pre-Paris trajectory, that thick red line. It's thick just because there's lots of different potentials in there. And you can see that what we've pledged is still better than our current policies. So we still have a long way to go of what we say we're doing versus what we actually are doing. And then even what we say we're doing is still far exceeding our 1.5 degrees. So that line at the bottom where that blue graph dips under is that 2-degree mark. So still have quite a ways to go to get to there. So I'm going to bring this to the last summit. This was COP26 in Glasgow last November. And this is where the final article of the Paris Accords was to be decided. So, you know, this is something that at this time was about 6 years old. I still haven't nailed down all aspects of it. This final article was on carbon markets, so climate financing. And Glasgow's overall goal as well was to confirm the pathway to that 1.5 degrees. Didn't really happen. I would say that I went to this conference with hope, but not expectation. That doesn't sound too negative or too positive about it. I don't know. I think, you know, there was a lot of us were feeling that we don't think anything's going to come out of it where it needs to, but, you know, can always hold on to something until they prove us wrong. So one thing that for me really came out of this conference that was so exciting that I hadn't really seen anywhere previously was the public enthusiasm and public support, and people coming from all over the world, not necessarily to participate in the conference. A lot of it is invitation only, but to be there and be seen and feel that everybody has a stake in the environment. It's not just for people in a boardroom. The COP process is still run largely by people in the boardroom, people making decisions. A lot of it was white men over the age of 60, sitting in a room together, hashing out details. So not the diversity, not necessarily all the groups reflected when we need to be reflected. A lot of people couldn't come due to COVID restrictions as well. But people who were walking from all over Europe for months to arrive here, somebody in a hamster wheel. It's just really exciting to see who was coming to the protests. People were, you know, closing shops because they couldn't find anybody to work because everybody wanted to get to protests. Taxi drivers were not driving anywhere because, again, you know, wanting to get out and be here. Bus routes the same. There were several other not counter protests, but other protests going on at the same time. For example, the sanitation workers in Glasgow, and they joined forces and protested. Other people in the climate movement joined theirs as well. So it was kind of fun and camaraderie there. There was a global day of action on the first Saturday in November, and more than 100,000 people showed up in the streets from Glasgow, or in Glasgow. So to march across the town. That was kind of fun to see. And a collection of the posters, because posters are kind of fun. And I like the creativity, and I like it when it's, you know, here are the ones in Glaswegian English. That was kind of fun. So, sort of just a little bit of what was at stake going into Glasgow, and certainly afterward, is, again, climate stripes I mentioned by Ed Hawkins. This starts in 1850, this one I believe, and goes up into the future. But here what we can see is, again, temperatures warming, get to a point where we have our 3-degree world that is our current projection without further changes. And if we want to make that 1.5 degrees stabilize at that, we need to be that net zero at 2050. So net zero is the idea that we're still emitting, but we're taking out the same number of emissions from the atmosphere, the same amount. As you can see in this earlier picture, the big no net zero poster in the middle. Net zero is quite a contentious issue, and it received quite a lot of attention in Glasgow, more than I feel like I had heard about it elsewhere. And because it's I guess a lot of protests against net zero, more in Glasgow than I had seen previously. The problem with net zero is that it's really relying on technology that we don't have to solve our problem that we have now. So there's a lot of talk about carbon sequestration, and if we just take the carbon out of the atmosphere and we have technology to do that, we can continue to emit. And you hear about this a lot from big banks and fossil fuel companies, and people who have invested in pollution effectively are saying, you know, it's okay because we can take this out of the atmosphere now. We have net zero, the emissions cancel out. But again, the big problem is the problem of scale. Last year, we emitted cumulatively around the world 31 billion tons of carbon. Last year, also, the world's largest carbon sequestration plant opened in Iceland, and it can currently take out 4 tons of carbon a year. So you've got 31 billion tons emitted, 4 tons extracted. So nowhere near equaling out. And whether, you know, we can create enough capacity to take an equal amount of carbon out of the atmosphere, you don't know if we can do that in the next 30 years. But again, you know, if you think about that 31 billion tons emitted last year, and you say that that's, if it doesn't increase from now, you know, it's not just going to be taking out 31 billion tons this year. We're going to have to take out 31 billion tons this year, with almost 31 billion tons last year, minus those 4 tons. So, you know, this is obviously an exponentially growing problem. So that's sort of the overarching issue with net zero. I don't know whether how much any of you paid attention to the conference, to this conference. This person here is Simon Kofa, who is the Minister of Justice, Communications and Foreign Affairs in Tuvalu, a Pacific Polynesian island in the Oceania region of the Pacific Ocean. And COVID blocked many people from traveling. And also, there's always concern with any of these events about getting on an airplane, emitting a lot of emissions, to go talk about cutting out emissions. And so lots of people traveling alternatively or connecting online. And so this was a fantastic speech, one of my favorites, certainly. But he spoke against the backdrop of waist deep in water. Basically, the point that a lot of the global north, the richer nations, can afford to disregard a lot of what's going on with the climate, see it as a problem for tomorrow, not for today. But his country, along with many of the other Polynesian islands, many of the other parts of the world, are being affected right now. And this isn't something that they can wait for tomorrow. Somebody else from the area said, if you're not going to make any changes, you might as well just bomb us now. So definitely that discrepancy between who can really afford these changes in the climate and who can't. So looking at the EU, just seeing Europe as in that leadership role, the EU supported about 150 side events at this conference, which attracted, I want to say 20,000 people. I think there were 40,000 people involved in some capacity at the conference, and the EU ran about 150 events, attracting about 20,000 people. And those were events that were in Glasgow, in Brussels. Many of them are online, so many of the participants were able to join online. But Europe, sort of its big trademark. I guess one of the mistakes, I should have probably said why Europe is fascinated basically by this conference, global climate conferences, is that it really sees them as within their own jurisdiction. As I said earlier, the first UN climate summit was held in Bonn, Germany in 1994. The UNFCCC is housed in Bonn. So while this conference is supposed to go around the world, it often defaults to Germany. So it's supposed to be in Chile 2019, but it wasn't able to be there due to the instability. So it went to Madrid. And next year it's scheduled to be in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And the following year in Abu Dhabi. So it does go around, but as I said, often defaults to Europe. So Europe has sort of that stake in it. With these two events, with the events that the EU held in Glasgow or related to the Glasgow conference, two of them ended up making it into the Glasgow pledges to the agreements that Europe really instigated. One is the Global Methane Pledge. So I'm familiar with that now. And this is that instead of carbon, we're always talking about carbon, there are a lot of other greenhouse gases, one of which is methane. Methane is critically important because it is about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide when it's initially released. After about 25 years, it breaks down into carbon dioxide and water. So although increasingly really impotent to begin with, it does become less, but cumulatively, obviously, it's more potent. And so this is the first time that anybody had spoken about reducing any other emission. So this pledge got a lot of support. The US was another country that really drove it. It is currently about 40% of what it needs, its targets of really what it needs to do to keep us in line with the Paris agreements. But it is, as I said, the first time that anybody's talked about methane in the past, or indeed anything that's not carbon. So that's kind of exciting as well. And the other goal was to really step up climate finance. This has been a goal since 2009 with Copenhagen Agreement, and the Copenhagen Agreement never really got the follow through that it needed. So this time reinvigorated steeper goals. And although it was voted to prioritize adaptation over mitigation, this fund is basically serves to support most vulnerable countries and small island states such as Simon Cofa's Tuvalu. And the EU is going to be the largest, or is the largest contributor, supporting about a third of this annual fund, and it increased its pledge here. So this is Europe right now is pledging about 28 billion euros per year toward this fund, assuming follow through. And so Europe's stake as well. One of the reasons that Europe is really in this position to do this, is that it holds one of its practices quite close, and that is that the ETS, or the emissions trading scheme, has been quite the mainstay of European climate policy since it began in 2005. And so that's what this screen shows now. The ETS system was, as I said, launched in 2005 to reduce rising emissions, and it's still a major pillar in European climate policy. And this is something, we have a similar system in Maine. You may be familiar with the RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is basically a cap and trade system Europe has. It covers now 11,000 organizations, factories, power stations, other institutions in Europe, and is present in 31 countries. So it's all member states of the EU, plus Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, United Kingdom. And so how the system works is there's a certain number of allowances, a certain amount of pollution that can be emitted. And over time, that allowance decreases, which means the value of that amount increases. So that basically the idea is that as it becomes more expensive to pollute, it pays to not pollute, to look for other ways of developing materials and other less emission intensive funds. So this has been a policy that at the beginning was not terribly effective. For a while, it cost about 10 cents to pollute a ton of carbon dioxide. Last year, it hit over 100 euros for the first time. So it's definitely increased, but it's been a definite learning curve. And we've got policies in the US. There's one currently in the House that's looking at doing a similar system. We'll talk about sort of the carbon fee and dividends, carbon fees that are in the US. I don't remember what the bill is. 2763, I'm not really certain, but Energy Innovation and Dividend Act is what is currently in the US. So the hope now is that this is in a phase that's going through 2030, and the aspiration is that we'll reduce about 66% of current emissions. But again, I said, that hasn't always been a very historically strong policy. So if they can keep the price of carbon high and encourage development elsewhere, can have a lot of successes, but it gets quite cheap again, and it's just very easy to pollute, then that will do so. So, but I said, it hit just at the end of last year, hit about 100 euros a ton, and that was up 200% from what it was last year. So the market's quite vulnerable, and it's also, or volatile, sorry. It's also quite vulnerable to cyber attacks, permitted offsets, and generally that hasn't really been strong enough yet on aggregate to spur innovation. Another issue with it is the so-called energy crisis at the moment that's going on in Europe. And that is just a lack of energy, a lack of heating oil, lack of ability to run vehicles for the energy for all purposes. This just shows, just for a visual, natural gas pipelines in Europe. So the green pipelines are existing pipelines. The red and orange lines around the coasts are existing liquid natural gas routes. So this is just sort of showing the network within Europe, highly dependent upon other countries. So here, see Europe in the center there. And what this is showing is Europe is really in a low area for natural resources, petroleum resources. Europe has historically relied on Russia, for example. Russia this has nothing to do with Ukraine, but has been feeding its more domestic needs recently, and has not been exporting to Europe as much as had been previously. The United States was a previous, again, provided a lot of oil to Europe. It's discovered that it gets more money sending that oil to Asia. So it's, again, prioritized Asia over Europe. Algeria was a significant supporter of Spain in the past and is no longer doing that. So Europe is kind of, not only does it not have its own resources, it's kind of been in some ways sheltered from the rest of the world, cut off from the rest of the world. Not cut off sounds negative, not necessarily in that sense, but hasn't gotten the oil that has previously received. So this has created, surging fuel prices, and with increased concerns over Europe's ability to rely on nuclear and wind power, et cetera, solar, especially as we're going recently, still going a bit through winter and colder seasons. So this has been met with increasing concerns, increasing demands to reopen non-renewable sources in Europe after Europe had made some attempts to get away from those. I did get into November. I was in Geneva at the UN, and I had a Russian get quite up in my face and start going on about how this energy crisis proves we cannot have renewables and we need to have fossil fuels, and if that's the end of the world, that's kind of the end of the world, but at least we all have heat, and therefore we're all happy. So it is quite a contentious issue. So another part of Europe that's kind of happening at the moment is the conversation about the EU Green Deal. This was implemented about 2 years ago, December 2019, and the goal is to make Europe the first carbon neutral continent. And Europe has described this as its sort of man on the moon moment. So again, talking about carbon neutral here, it's same issues with carbon neutral we have with net zero. If we're carbon neutral, we can still emit carbon as long as we can get rid of it. But again, they are investing in the renewable sources as well, so it's not quite the same thing. And the impact assessed plan, this is also going through all sorts of every single EU policy to look at how it can be adjusted for climate. And the plan is that it can hopefully reduce emissions in this capacity by 50 up to 55% by the end of this decade as compared with 1990 levels. So again, this is looking at circular economy, farming, innovation, biodiversity, building renovations, how buildings are heated, insulated, constructed, etc. Obviously, COVID has thrown in a few loopholes, some of which have been integrated, some not. Poland has said that they're not going to be able to get away from coal, so they're not interested in participating in this. Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania have all said that something very similar, and saying that if this is an EU-wide policy, it threatens their ability to remain within the EU because they're not going to be able to meet those targets for the end of the decade. And they decided that it's not really fair because some countries, the wealthier countries, could have already been making these adjustments in the past and haven't because they haven't been forced to. So now to sort of get everybody on board when some countries have a lot more resources, it's not fair. Europe does have resources for countries that are struggling with us, but again, it's getting into the issue of fairness. And the Romanian president has said that this is something that following Brexit's lead would be a reason that Romania would consider leaving the EU now that it has at least has been done, and has wondered whether it's would spur other countries as well to follow Britain's lead. I'm not personally not really sure that any country would leave the EU based on this policy, but certainly it has been mentioned publicly. One issue also with this policy is that I think where we get into that kind of question on trust and who's controlling what is that it was originally drawn up in part by ExxonMobil, and other oil giants. They were part of the original design, basically deciding which areas of infrastructure would be most impacted. And nobody knew that they were involved in the very early stage discussions, negotiations. But they were involved in deciding which areas of the infrastructure would be impacted initially, where petroleum reductions would be made, in part not to damage their own stake. So largely, for example, not transportation and petroleum-driven cars would not be a priority. But largely the criticism that I hear that I most relate to is that this whole plan is, well, great, too little, too late, could have done it, lots of loopholes open for countries that are either not willing or not able to join. So lots of energy on Europe's part, and certainly stands to suffer, some fuel loss without some kind of just transition. And it's been dealing with consequential migration crises, the migration crisis of 2015, which is still going on. My only involvement with that was I was going to a rowing race in France, and I was driving from England to France with a trailer, and we'd gotten to Calais in France, parked the trailer for a little bit, and had everything covered up in the back. Got back in and started driving, and about an hour down the road was this massive noise, chaos in the back. Pulled over to see what was going on. Turned out that a handful of people who were trying to get into England had climbed into the back of our trailer and covered themselves up, and when they realized that we weren't going to England, they had to get out. So they had to, obviously alert us to their presence. So it was quite interesting. But things like that are certainly related to the climate and people looking for a habitable climate. And 100 years ago, talking about climate migration was something of people wanting to go to a nice place. I want to live in Maine because I like the winter, and it has a winter, and it has a nice summer, and it has 4 seasons. Whatever you want to say, you went somewhere because that's where you wanted to go. And now when we talk about climate migration, it's I'm in a place where I cannot live. So I need to go somewhere where I can. So instead of going to somewhere, you're going away from somewhere. So I just find that kind of an interesting concept. But we're talking about the heat waves, Europe, heat waves the past couple of years, drought, how many fires, fire up on the hill right behind me right now, loss, changes of growing seasons, disastrous floods, had quite a few of those recently here. But it also has a lot of opportunities, a lot of wealthy nations, a lot of strong policies, and some oomph behind them. So stands to do fairly well, but has some up and downs. So with that, we're all sort of looking forward this year in Egypt to COP27 to see where we stand, where we don't, and going back to my hedge on COP26 about my lack of expectations. Overall, I'd say that it certainly didn't succeed, but it's in part because its big takeaway was we're not making these plans now, which we're supposed to. We're going to make them next year. We're all going to come back with better plans. So I guess if we get this November, we get to Egypt and everybody has bigger plans, then I have to take back the fact that I said that Glasgow wasn't a success. So yeah, and I'll just close with a couple photos that are local, some photos of Maine that were taken the 17th of January. So we had high tide and some rain. So this is Kennebunk, and this is South Freeport, and this is Rockland. So just, this is right here, a 3-foot tide is estimated by Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And that's sort of what you're saying by 2100 would be sort of our best case scenario. Anything from 3 foot to 10 foot. So, just seeing that, these storm surges that we're getting, the tide rising, Maine is sort of in that place where we have the luxury to feel really removed in some ways. We're not waist deep in water yet anyway. We're not having the scorching summers, the fires of the west. But the Gulf of Maine is heating. It's the fastest heating body of water in the ocean in the world. And body of water in the ocean, that makes little sense, but fastest body of water heating in the world. And so we've got a lot of changes in the pipe forthcoming. So it's kind of an interesting place to be at the moment. So with that, I think I will stop and take any questions or any further discussion. So
there is a question here in the chat, I think just in reference to your very last comment, why is Maine warming faster than the US as a whole, or the Gulf of Maine, I guess?
Yeah, so the Gulf of Maine specifically is warming quite quickly for several reasons. One is that it's kind of a C shape. And so water gets into the Gulf of Maine. It's also shallow. Water gets into the Gulf of Maine and it can't really get out very easily. So we have, coming up the coast, we've got the Gulf Stream, and then the Gulf Stream is warm water. And it's also slowing. And as it slows, it's getting pushed to the coast a bit, coming in right towards Maine. And then from the north, we've got the Labrador Current, which comes up with Greenland and Canada, and that's cold water. So normally what should happen is the cold water sinks and the warm water rises, and the cold water should keep the Gulf of and as the Gulf, so cold water sinks. But what's also happening is that with the melting of the Arctic, the Labrador Current is losing a lot of its salt. So it's becoming a lot less salty than it should be, which means it's also heavier. So it is sinking faster, and it is basically being overtaken by the Gulf Stream. So really being depowered. So the Gulf Stream is really coming into Maine and a lot closer to shore and getting into the Gulf, where again, it's warming up faster because it's a shallow body of water. And so it's warmer water going in there to begin with.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? You can put them in the chat or feel free to unmute if you'd like to ask a question. I'll give everyone a minute to think. While I mentioned that the next program in our climate series is happening on Tuesday, when we will be joined by State Representative Lydia Bloom and members of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation in the Future to talk about Maine's climate action plan and what actions are happening there. So a little more specifically to where we are, but as very obviously, discussed in this presentation, it's all related, I'm not seeing any other questions pop in. So I think we will let Dr. Hancock get to bed in Monaco, and thank her very much for coming out and sharing her research with York Public Library. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.